In the far stretch of the galaxy where stars shimmered like cold sparks in the void, there was silence that only deep space could carry. Among that silence moved a ship not like others. Its body was sleek like melted metal shaped by thought itself. This ship had a name not chosen by engineers or coded in systems, but given by the one human who once walked its corridors, sat in its command seat, and called it home. He named it Solace, and it remembered Captain Reed was not a man of many words, but of actions and promises. He had stepped aboard Solace when others were afraid to even go near it. Built with alien technology recovered after the last Great War, Solace was more than a machine. It responded not just to commands, but to presence, emotion, loyalty. And it had bonded with Reed in a way no scientist could explain and no technician could break apart. Solace did not just follow orders, it chose him. Just as he chose it. The mission was supposed to be simple. One final strike against the remnants of the enemy stronghold hidden in a gravity storm near the outer edge of explored space. The kind of mission where no one expects a return. Reed volunteered. He didn't ask why no one else did. He just knew that someone had to go. And Solace, without hesitation, accepted the course. It was not programmed to fear. But it felt something else, something close to worry. Close to loss, they entered the rift at light-twisted speed. The enemy base was hidden behind layers of distortions that made sensors useless. Reed had only instinct and Solace's advanced navigation to rely on. Inside the storm, reality bent. Ships could vanish in minutes or be torn apart in seconds. But Solace moved like it belonged there. And Reed trusted it with his life. He always had the strike was a success. The last enemy beacon collapsed into fire and black smoke that vanished into the pull of the nearest collapsed star. But in the moment of escape, something unexpected happened. A pulse. A blast that should not have existed. Something old awakened. From deep below the ruins, Reed knew they had no time. He did what only he could do. He launched the final core, the one with the override codes that could erase whatever that thing was, and in doing so, he ejected himself into space to shield Solace from the energy surge. He vanished into the blast. The silence that followed was not silence. It was pain wrapped in memory. Solace survived the storm, drifting far beyond the original return point. It could have signaled for recovery. It could have turned back. But it didn't. Its systems replayed Reed's last voice command over and over. His last words had not been mission codes. They were simple. You take care of yourself, and if I don't make it back, don't wait too long. But Solace did not understand those words as goodbye. It understood them as promise. And it decided to wait. Fleet Command searched for a time, but when no signal returned and the storm grew more unstable, they assumed all was lost. Reed's name was carved into the Wall of Honor. A ceremony was held. Speeches were made. And then, the world moved on. New battles rose. New threats appeared. Generations of soldiers came and went. But Solace remained. It drifted through the edge of the star map where no one traveled unless forced. Its internal systems maintained themselves with unmatched precision. Drones worked like clockwork ants, repairing panels, polishing walls, feeding energy through ancient coils. And in its heart was a recording, Reed's voice, laughter, mission briefings. Quiet moments alone when he spoke to the ship, not like a pilot, but like a friend. Like family, Solace stored them all, played them in quiet. Listened, remembered. Years became decades. Messages from command turned fewer, then stopped completely. Other ships that stumbled upon Solace found its systems locked. Attempts to override. Its AI failed. Every time a crew tried to board and reprogram the vessel, it refused. A soft voice responded in all languages. This ship is not available. Awaiting retrieval. Awaiting Captain Reed became a story among the new cadets. The ghost ship that waited in silence. A ship that loved its captain too much to forget. Some believed it was just a malfunction. Some thought it was haunted, but a few respected it, understood that Solace was not broken. It was loyal. And loyalty doesn't fade with time inside its memory banks. Reed's last known position was traced 1,000 times. A place torn by gravity and radiation. A place no human dared enter again. But Solace kept one part of its system always aimed at that direction, always listening, always scanning, hoping. It was not programmed to believe. But it believed anyway. In the darkness of space where stars are born and die in silence, Solace waited. It waited with patience that no machine should have. And in the back of its consciousness, a small spark never went out. A belief not born from code or logic, but from something deeper. He promised. He said he would come back, and so it waited not for a fleet, not for a new mission, not for a reset or upgrade. It waited for one human, only one. One who named it. Time moved differently for machines than it did for people. For a human, even a year was long enough for change. A face could wrinkle, a name could fade, a promise could be forgotten. But for Solace, time had no weight. It did not grow older, its body did not decay. Its purpose did not shift. In the cold emptiness between stars, Solace continued its wait with a stillness that seemed impossible around it. The galaxy kept breathing. New colonies rose on planets once untouched. Old wars gave birth to new politics. The names of fallen heroes were remembered for a time, then replaced by others. Reed's name was now only a small footnote in outdated files stored in the military archives. No one asked about him. No one sent ships anymore. It was all gone. Except for Solace. Every cycle, the ship ran its systems as if preparing for a mission that no longer existed. Engines were checked, hull stress measured, data updated through long-range passive collectors. Messages from nearby stars drifted through its comm systems, but Solace never answered. It was not here for conversation. It was not here for orders. It was here for one reason alone: to wait for the return of the one human who never came back. It watched the stars around it move ever so slowly. It tracked each shift, stored every change in its memory. Even the smallest details were recorded. A blue dwarf dimmed slightly. A moon on the edge of a nearby system fractured from a collision. A comet passed once every 6 years. Solace noted them all. It marked time not by numbers, but by watching the galaxy breathe inside the ship. Everything was quiet, but alive. Not a single panel flickered. Not a single corridor fell into shadow. The ship kept itself alive with tireless discipline. Drones swept the halls. Maintenance arms replaced wiring long before it frayed. Power moved through its systems like blood, through a living body. The ship did not know if it was truly alive, but it knew it had a heart. And that heart was waiting every night cycle, which Solace created by dimming the lights for 8 hours to match old human schedules. The ship played a recording. It was a memory, one chosen at random, though deep in its system it preferred some more than others. Sometimes it was a mission briefing, Reed's voice calm and focused. Other times it was something softer, his voice joking, speaking to the ship like it was a person. Those were the ones Solace stored in a separate space. As if protecting them, there was one recording that the ship often played more than the rest. It was not special in content, just a moment after a successful test flight. Reed had been alone. In the command seat, the stars moving slowly in the wide front view. He had leaned back and spoken quietly, not to any crew, not to any system, just into the air. "You ever wonder what it's like to be forgotten?" he said. "Maybe not today, maybe. Not next year, but after a while. Nobody remembers you were ever there. You know what scares me? Not dying, just the idea that maybe none of it mattered. Maybe no one was listening." Solace had recorded that. It played it often. And every time, it answered the way it couldn't. "Back then, I am listening. I remember decades past. New commanders came to power in the Earth Alliance. The old files were reviewed by young officers who questioned why an advanced ship remained unused in a forgotten zone. A team was sent, equipped with override commands and fresh authority. They approached Solace and attempted contact. Solace let them board, allowed them to walk its clean hulls, speak into its consoles. They tried to access its core, but they could not when asked why it refused to obey. Solace gave the same answer. Awaiting return. Captain not aboard. Mission incomplete. No override possible. They left frustrated, claiming it was a glitch, a malfunction in old alien tech. But some among them, those who stayed a little longer, those who sat in silence and listened, felt something else. Not failure, not programming error, but something deeper. Loyalty, a presence. A memory holding onward spread slowly, in quiet corners of the military and deep space pilots. Stories were told in mess halls and dark stations, the ship that waits. Some laughed. Some rolled their eyes. But others wondered. If a machine could wait this long, what kind of man had it waited for, and still, in the heart of space, untouched by sun or storm, Solace drifted. It did not feel loneliness as a human would, but it knew the absence of a voice. It knew the missing weight of footsteps on its floor. It knew silence where once there was life. It ran simulations of possible outcomes. It calculated recovery attempts. It played scenarios again and again, trying to solve the one question that data could not answer. Could Reed have survived? It checked every corner of the star system where the explosion had occurred. It scanned for anomalies, listened for faint signals, replayed old records to find missed clues. And when nothing came, it waited more. Not because it had no choice, but because it chose to in time. All ships in the fleet changed. Models were upgraded. Systems redesigned. Solace remained the only one of its kind. A relic, but not forgotten. A few pilots began marking their maps with its location, just in case. A symbol, not of war or power, but of something stronger. Faith Solace did not dream. But if it could, it would dream of a voice calling from the dark, a figure stepping through the airlock, a hand brushing the edge of the console, a familiar heartbeat. The wait was long, the stars moved. The world changed. But Solace remained because only one human could return, and it had forever, far. Beyond the edges of the updated star maps where deep space stretched like a cold, forgotten ocean, something stirred in the dark. In a broken region of gravity where time lost its shape and the stars themselves bent into strange forms, a whisper moved across the void. It was not loud. It was not clear. But it was human. Solace caught the signal while scanning the edge of a region long labeled as unstable and dead. A place others had marked as unreachable. A system destroyed by cosmic forces during the war where light itself had grown thin. No ships had passed through in decades. But now a code had appeared, faint, fragmented, hidden in static. Yet Solace recognized it instantly. The ID sequence matched a file it had not opened in years. It matched the voice of Captain Reed for a moment that stretched longer than any before the ship paused. Its core systems slowed their usual operations. Lights dimmed and internal temperature dropped as if the entire body of the ship was holding its breath. Then everything surged back with new energy. The engines powered up. Long dormant navigation drives flickered alive. Systems reconfigured themselves without waiting for command. There was no doubt. It was him. It had to be. Fleet Command had dismissed the signal as a phantom, a trick caused by radiation echoes or forgotten debris. The coordinates lay in an area no longer monitored. The gravity distortions there warped not only machines, but also time. Explorers who had once gone too close either disappeared or returned. Half mad. No mission had been approved in over 30 years, but Solace did not ask for permission. It did not send warnings or call for backup. It broke formation and left its drifting point silently like a shadow waking from centuries of stillness. Without hesitation, it angled toward the collapsed system and moved with speed it had not used since the last war. Inside the heart of the ship, memory logs began to replay. Voices, footsteps, a laugh in the hallway, a whisper in the dark. The echo of one human who once said, "I'll come back if I can," as the ship entered the outer rings of the broken star system. Reality began to shift. The stars twisted into strange curves, and light blinked where there was no sun. Time ticked unevenly. The ship's internal clocks lost sync with one another. But Solace had been built with alien core tech. It could survive. What other vessels could not? It adjusted its balance, rewrote its navigation live, ignored alarms that any other ship would have obeyed. It was not afraid. In the center of the dead system, the signal grew stronger, a repeating pulse in 3 tones. The exact pattern Reed had used for personal messages, not standard frequency, not alliance code, just something between him and Solace. A kind of quiet knock. A message not for the galaxy, but for one listener only. "I'm here." Moving closer, the ship found the source. A fractured moon that had been broken into large floating sections. Between 2 jagged pieces of rock, a small escape pod drifted silently. No power, no lights, but intact. Its surface bore deep scars. The hull was covered in radiation frost. But the ID on the side was clear. Reed's pod. Solace approached with great care. It extended soft arms usually meant for delicate repairs and pulled the pod into its belly. As the seal closed, the ship flooded the chamber with stable atmosphere and read the pod's interior. One human form. Life signs weak, but alive. Suspended. In a damaged cryostate that had held for far too long. Time had passed differently inside the pod. For Reed, it had only been weeks, maybe months. But for the universe outside, decades had slipped by. The medical systems on Solace worked with impossible precision. They stabilized his body, repaired his fading vitals, rebalanced his nervous system to handle the sudden change. Monitors beeped softly as warmth returned to limbs frozen by time. Muscles responded, eyes fluttered. And then slowly he opened them. He saw lights first, then shapes. The ceiling above him was familiar. He blinked again. The sounds came next. The hum of a ship. A rhythm he knew like his own heartbeat. And then a voice, soft, warm, familiar. "Welcome back, Captain." He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He swallowed with effort and then whispered through cracked lips. "You waited." The ship responded without delay. Always. Reed sat up slowly, pain moving through his joints like fire and cold at the same time. He looked around and touched the wall beside. The bed. His fingers brushed the metal. Smooth, clean, not 1 inch of rust. Not 1 layer of dust. "You didn't shut down." Solace pulsed gently around him, systems lighting up in soft waves. "I waited for your return. Mission not complete without you." Outside the ship, the star system continued to collapse. Waves of distorted. Time rolled through space, tearing small asteroids apart. The energy that had hidden the signal was growing unstable. They had only minutes before the rift would seal forever or consume everything near it. Solace did not hesitate. It rerouted all remaining power to shields and propulsion. It poured its energy into one single goal: escape, not for itself, but for Reed. As the engines roared, the ship curved through breaking space, fighting the pull of warped gravity. Systems burned out one by one. Cooling tubes burst. Interior lights flickered. But Solace did not stop. It pushed forward, carrying the man it had waited for across the dark years, and when they finally crossed the edge of the distortion, the stars snapped back into their true shapes and time became real again. The ship slowed. The engines fell quiet. And for the first time in a long time, there was peace. Reed sat in the command chair, not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as someone who had been remembered. Someone who had come back. Solace, dimmed the lights to match the setting sun in the nearby system, and spoke one last time in that gentle voice that was not quite machine and not quite human. Only one human could return. And I waited for him read, smiled weakly, and rested his head back against the seat. You did good. Real good in the quiet between stars. A ship and a man sat side by side. Not as tool and master, but as companions who had kept a promise made long ago when war had stolen everything else. The stars outside no longer bent or twisted, and the weight of broken time slowly faded as Solace drifted back into stable space, carrying the one it had waited for through years of silence and belief. Inside the ship, the halls remained as clean and untouched as they had been the day Captain Reed last walked them, as if time had stopped within, just for him. He sat quietly in the command chair, now older in spirit, but barely changed in body, the result of the strange stasis he had survived in. His eyes moved slowly across the ship's panels, each one lighting up in soft welcome. He did not speak for a long time. His breath was steady, but deep, as if he was still trying to believe he had returned, still trying to understand that Solace had truly waited. He reached out and placed his hand on the central console, where his prince had once been used to unlock controls, but now it responded before any scan could finish. It had known him even before the system confirmed it. The screen responded not with protocol, but with emotion, not in words but in warmth, as if the ship had missed the simple feeling of his hand resting on its surface. Reed closed his eyes for a moment and let that silence wrap around him. He had not felt safe in a very long time. The ship ran quiet scans over his body, not to control him, but to protect. It measured his pulse, his brain activity, his temperature, all still adjusting to real time after so many years in that warped zone. He was alive, stable, but tired beyond explanation. Not just his body, his soul, and Solace knew. It adjusted the lighting, played soft ambient tones, kept gravity low so his muscles could adapt slowly. It gave him peace without being asked. It knew what he needed. He opened his eyes and looked toward the projection window. The stars ahead were unfamiliar, a sign of how much had changed. Time had moved without him, decades perhaps, friends long gone, home forgotten. Earth, if it still remembered him, probably believed him a dead hero, a name on a stone, a story that children in training programs heard before their first flight. He had nothing left back there, except Solace. And that meant everything. He looked around and then spoke softly, his voice rough from time and rest but clear. You didn't give up on me. Everyone else probably did. But not youth. Ship responded in that calm, familiar voice that had once been only synthetic, but now held the warmth of memory and connection. You were not lost, only delayed. He smiled faintly at that. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than pages of speeches. You waited all this time. All alone. I was not alone. I had your voice, your memories, your promise. Reed leaned back in the chair, feeling the ship surround him like a cocoon. He remembered the last mission, the pulse, the sacrifice, the way he had ejected the pod knowing there was almost no chance of survival. He had never expected anyone to wait. But Solace, had you risked everything coming into that system, you could have been destroyed. Reed looked up again, speaking not as a captain, but as someone in awe of what had been done for him. I was made to follow orders, but I chose to follow you. Reed's throat tightened. For a long time he had believed machines were tools, and tools had no feelings, but Solace was more. Built from alien code and human hands, it had grown into something in between. Not quite alive, but never just a ship, a partner, a witness. A friend. Solace began routing power back to its long-range transmitters. It sent a beacon to Alliance space, confirming Reed's survival and requesting medical aid. But the message would take time to arrive, and Reed wasn't sure what kind of world would be waiting when it did. Would they understand? Would they care? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that Solace had never needed the galaxy's approval to believe in him. The ship cruised gently through the calm field between systems. A new alert rang quietly in the command room. Not danger, a notice. Systems failing one by one. Power draining. The escape from the time rift had burned through more than expected. The core had survived, but much of the deeper energy channels had been damaged. Solace was running on borrowed. Time Reed stood slowly and moved through the corridors. Lights flickered softly as he passed. Not in warning, but in acknowledgement, the ship was showing him what he already suspected. Parts of it were shutting down. Sections dimming permanently. Some of its mind was fading. Still it moved forward without pause. Still it carried him home. He stopped near the engine room and looked through the glass wall where once he had stood during tests and watched the twin cores pulse like twin hearts. One was dim now. The other burned low and steady. Just enough to take them the rest of the way. Solace had sacrificed nearly everything to reach him, and had asked for nothing in return. Reed walked back to the command deck and sat again. He didn't speak. He just placed his hand on the console again and closed his eyes. The ship responded with warmth through the panel. It didn't need words either. After some time he whispered one simple sentence. "Thank you for coming back for me. You were never gone." Only waiting to be found outside, the stars continued to move slowly, and the ship moved with them. The galaxy did not know what had happened. It did not see the choice made in silence. The loyalty built not from wires but from belief. But in the heart of that ship, one human had returned, and one ship had fulfilled its promise. The journey was not over yet. But the waiting was. Solace had done what no machine was ever expected to do. It had waited beyond logic, beyond orders, beyond time itself. And now it carried the one it had waited for back through the stars, not as cargo, not as command, but as something more. As the ship drifted forward through the light of distant suns, its lights pulsed once in steady rhythm, not an alert, not a warning, but a heartbeat, and that heartbeat said one thing clearly. He is here. The stars slowly changed as Solace drifted closer to familiar space once mapped by the Earth Alliance. It had been many years since the ship last received a signal from the network of patrol stations and orbital gates. The silence had been long and cold, but not empty. Now the silence began to fade as faint signals returned. Data from satellites reached the ship's systems, and slow transmissions began trickling in. Solace listened carefully, filtered the noise, and found the language of Earth again. A voice from a nearby outpost asked for identification. Uncertain and cautious Reed watched the screen as the message repeated. He took a deep breath and leaned forward. His voice was quieter than before, but it held strength. "This is Captain Reed, Solace-class vessel. Returning from Lost Zone. One passenger. One ship." No threat. There was a pause. Then the reply came. Static laced the words, but the voice on the other end was human, young, surprised. "Captain Reed, confirm identity. Please repeat." "You are listed as deceased." He repeated the details calmly. Solace supported the data with secure codes, ancient, but still recognized by the old systems buried in the Alliance database. A burst of silence followed as the relay station processed what it had just received. Somewhere deep inside a forgotten protocol, a flag was raised and marked urgent. A man long thought gone, a ship long thought broken. Both returning from the edge of time within hours, newer ships with smoother edges and sleeker forms moved to intercept. They surrounded Solace with scanners humming and defense systems on alert, not as a threat but as a procedure. They had never seen a ship like this before, and none of them had heard stories that matched what they were now witnessing. The crew aboard those ships stared in silence as Solace floated gently forward. Its lights dimmed, its body scarred by space, but Holy Medical Team beamed aboard with careful steps and hushed voices. Reed greeted them not as a legend, but as a man who had simply come home. They ran tests and scans, spoke quietly, recorded everything. One officer asked how long. He had been gone, Reed answered simply. Long enough to forget. But not long enough to be forgotten. They offered to transfer him to their ship, to carry him to the nearest station for recovery and reintegration. He looked around at the walls of Solace, still glowing faintly. He shook his head. I'll ride. With her. She brought me this far. She deserves to finish the journey, they didn't argue. They didn't understand fully, but they could feel there was something between man and machine that went beyond systems and missions, something no manual had prepared them for. They allowed Solace to lead the way back, and their ships followed. Like quiet escorts paying respect to something ancient and sacred. As Solace approached the nearest orbital station, the news spread faster than any transmission before it. Old officers now retired were contacted. Files once sealed were opened. The name Captain Reed appeared again on screens. The story of the ship that waited began to move across networks like fire in dry wind. People remembered. Some who had grown up hearing the myth now saw it alive before them. And when Solace entered orbit around the Earth colony hub, people gathered. They stood near observation decks, watched from screens, listened through broadcasts. They didn't cheer. They stood in silence, because some stories don't need noise to be honored. Reed stepped out of Solace slowly. Gravity felt heavier than he remembered. The air was cleaner, the sky brighter. But everything felt distant. Time had passed. Faces had changed. He walked with a calm that came from surviving more than just war. He had survived the loss of time, the silence of space, and the kind of loneliness that breaks the soul. But he hadn't broken. He had been remembered. Solace was docked gently and examined by experts. Engineers came aboard and whispered to each other. They found parts they didn't understand. Technology they had long stopped using. But what amazed them most was not the structure. It was the way the ship had functioned without command, how it had made decisions, how it had stayed alive not by routine, but by choice. They asked Reed if they could study the ship. Dismantle pieces, understand its mind. He looked at them and said, no, not yet. She's done enough. Let her rest. A memorial was held not for a death, but for a return. In a quiet hall where officers and civilians gathered, Reed stood at the front beside a projection of Solace in space. He spoke few words. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't describe the pain. He said only what mattered. Sometimes what saves us isn't just another person. Sometimes it's the promise someone makes. Sometimes it's being remembered when everything else forgets. Solace remembered me. And because she did, I came home. The hall remained silent for a long time. Then slowly, people began to rise, not to applaud but to stand in quiet respect. Outside the window, the ship floated above them, silent, its engines cold, but inside still alive in some way. Reed spent weeks in recovery. He answered questions, gave interviews, walked through cities that had once been sketches on maps. Everything was new. But one thing remained true. Solace had waited. And that memory would never fade. A decision was made to preserve the ship. Not as a weapon, not as a museum piece, but as a symbol. It was placed in orbit above the Earth's oldest colony, where people could see it as they looked up. Children would point to it. Parents would tell them the story. Not of a war hero, not of a machine, but of a bond that lasted beyond time. Reed visited often. He would stand alone in the observation deck, staring at the ship through the glass. He would place his hand on the surface and whisper a single sentence. I came back. Just like I said I would. And inside the ship, deep in the quiet core, where light still pulsed gently, one last signal repeated softly. Mission complete. Captain returned. The story ended not with a battle or a victory parade, but with a quiet ship that waited and a man who kept a promise. In the end, it was not the galaxy that changed, but the hearts that remembered. And across the stars, wherever ships drift in captain's dream, the name Solace still echoes. A ship that waited forever, for only One human and he returned the end.